We talked a little bit earlier about, HR and influence versus power. And, often HR is not even in the room when decisions are being made. What is the problem with that with human resources?
What's the problem in terms of why they're not being introduced to those
Yeah,
rooms?
I mean, I have my own comments about that, but I'm more interested in hearing yours. Like, what's the problem with human resources? Why are there so many bad HR people?
Yeah, I think so. I would say it's a bit of supply and demand, to use an economic term. So the
Yeah.
first thing is, if we look at this, let's look at the demand side of the curve. It's more fun. What most organizations want from their HR leaders is not what you just said. They
Right.
want someone to write policies to keep
Yeah.
them out of the
Right.
courts and out of the newspaper. They want
Right.
essentially
All the governmental
they want a
crap.
governmental.
Yeah.
They want a sheriff to walk around and make sure everyone's got the dress code managed properly.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that is still a large percentage of companies, and that's not
Yeah.
changed in a post-pandemic world. It's not
Right.
everybody, and it's certainly smaller in size than it once was, but there is an expectation of, we don't want HR to be a strategic part of the business. I'll give you an
Right.
example. And I won't mention the company's name because it's not
Yeah.
fair. But when I worked with an
Obviously.
organization previously, I actually built a business case to turn HR into a profit center. That is, I would generate revenue in greater amounts than the cost of my function. And the deal I wanted to make was, if I could generate revenues in excess of my costs, that I wanted to keep 50% to further invest into the function and build
Sure.
a truly next level HR department. But the
Right.
remaining 50% could go to the bottom line.
Yep.
And I rolled out a business case. I built a business case that was predicated on a couple of areas that would be close to your heart, Carol. One of the areas was we got really good at finding and acquiring developer talent. I couldn't tell you why. It's one of those, like, we just found this fissure in the matrix where it just all seemed to line up. And we had an abundance of qualified talent at a time when people were screaming for developers.
Right. Right.
I began placing developers that I had interviewed in my organization but didn't have spots for into my friends' organizations, so they had, and I took a fee for it.
Yeah, of course you did. I mean, you're not stupid.
And I was able to figure out how to make that work from an accounting perspective. It was a very interesting conversation. The first day I went to the CFO and said, hey, I need you to put in a revenue line on my P&L because I have some revenue for you. Where do you want me to code it? And he was like, this has never happened before. So that was part of the conversation. The other part we actually were working on was to white label our training. We worked in an industry that had a lot of organizations that were looking for this type of training. We were able to white label it and then license it out to our competition, who were able to use it in their programs. Again, we invested the cost to build it, but we were able to recoup the cost and make a profit by selling the content into the broader market. When I took that business case along with some other ideas that I had to our board, I was explicitly told in no uncertain terms to not move forward because HR's job was not to be strategic, but my job was to make sure that everyone else did their jobs.
Oh my God.
So to put that business case in my desk drawer and go back and write a policy. So that was an organization that up to that point had been very successful, very aligned, and had been considered to be cutting edge. But when push came to shove, when we had transcended the traditional HR circumstance and ready to graduate into a more strategic role, we weren't allowed to move forward because the business wouldn't let us. So that's one part of it. I'm not saying that's entirely the case, because the inverse of that coin is the demand side. This is the HR responsibility to show up as people that should be in these conversations. So let's separate the people that don't have the skills or don't have the interest. And that would be, I would suggest, a significant portion of the pie. The remaining people who have an interest, but may not have the skills, or have the skills, but don't have the mandate, those individuals can go to their organizations and build business cases to say, this is why HR needs to be at the conversation table, because stats around human resources, diversity and inclusion, talent, and how they drive business performance. Here's the impact of a workforce shift around engagement and what it would mean to the bottom line, what it will mean to risk, safety, profitability, pick whatever you want. We can build those business cases. The problem is the system that is currently in place that is meant to develop HR leaders is so horribly broken, I can't even begin to explain to you.
Well, yeah.
The Professional Association in the United States, which is the, I would say the governing body, but is the Professional Association of the United States, at this point still does not acknowledge that data and analytics is part of the HR practice. It is 2022.
Wow.
It is an organization of accountants masquerading as HR professionals. And that is how the organization runs. It is policy. It is compliance. It is back office administration. It is personnel managers from my parents' generation and their parents' generation. And those functions in their HR, while they still exist, are largely being automated or largely being transferred to finance. And where HR is growing are in all the areas in which that traditional view of HR needs to grow. Talent, workplace psychology, data and analytics, influence and persuasion. I mean, Carol, I actually think in the future, if we don't get this right, they're just going to blend marketing and HR because it's exactly the same skill sets. Just give a marketing person a policy manual and say, just tell the organization how to do this. Because HR currently takes an overly administrative view for what is a strategic problem. And that's on them, but I feel bad because if I say, fix it, I know full well that our professional association isn't going to help them. You go to most university programs at the undergraduate, graduate level, the HR module in my MBA, I literally wrote a letter to my university and said, you need to update this. This is information that's 50 years old. And that was what was offered in an MBA program. That was business students from around the world being exposed to, this is the HR module. And it was embarrassing how rudimentary and how unstrategic it was. We did a Myers-Briggs assessment in it, which doesn't even prove my science. Like it was not, and that's not their fault necessarily, except that the world is moving quickly. So is HR. And part of the issue with supply is that there's presently, other than on-the-job experience with a really good leader, it's really hard to grow the things that we're talking about on this call today. People have to do it themselves or they have to find a really good leader. And that's a tall order at a time when people have a lot to worry about. So I have a lot of empathy, but I acknowledge the consequence of the situation, Carol, is, as you say, we have a lot of HR people who are struggling to find influence, struggling to perform, and organizations that are just screaming for a high level of service and performance. But we are where we are. We have to fundamentally change the system that we're in.
Do you believe it's, I mean, I always say the buck stops at the CEO founder, right? The CEO, that's the individual who doesn't understand, like it's living in a blind spot. They don't understand the value of a strategic partner in human resources. If they could find that person.
So here's what I think. I think there are smart leaders who think that they could do the HR positions themselves. Because they can spot good talent.
There are people in that business who think they can do my job and they can't.
Precisely. So there are people who think they can be recruiters, they can be HR leaders because they grew the business from zero to whatever state they got it to when they brought that person on board. And they have a confirmation bias that their success became because they knew how to build relationships and grow a team. And they forget the fact that they probably burned people out along the way, or people left, or they have 5 lawsuits, or they look at the bigger picture and they, as a consequence, forget or misremember some of the things that happened along the way, or they never believed it to begin with. And they have a view of people that is, they're meant to be exploited for their benefit. And the ends justify the means. And they try and incent them through providing high salaries or big bonuses or fancy titles. And they hope that will keep people loyal in absence of a culture. And there's merit to those arguments insofar as they likely work in the short term, but I haven't seen them work in the long term unless people are intrinsically motivated. That is motivation that cannot be compelled from the outside. If they're intrinsically motivated, they will likely stay and support your organization. And if they're not, they'll look for the next best opportunity when it makes sense, and then they'll move. So I think part of it, Carol, is just, it's a confirmation bias. I think also part of it is the HR profession is a lot of work that people would rather not do themselves because it's uncomfortable. So it's easy to dismiss it. It's easy to dismiss the fact that you have to talk to somebody who's having a performance problem, and that's actually somebody else's problem, or that somebody is having a hard day at home and they want to talk about it with their boss. That's a tough conversation to have. It's easy to pass that discomfort onto somebody else and therefore denigrate the work because you couldn't be bothered to handle it yourself. So it's a complicated issue. But that being said, I have optimism. I'm seeing more and more founders with organizations that take a very talent-centric view that understand the value of a professional recruiter or a professional HR individual. That is shifting because they're starting to realize that allows them to grow and have competition in a different way. In addition to how everything else has changed, how you ultimately have success in business has also changed. So you no longer want to build the biggest, most efficient widget possible. That was what Walmart did. That was what Amazon did. But as the world shifts and it becomes more of a talent conversation, it becomes more three-dimensional. And therefore, you're seeing more founders and leaders recognize this and understand that they have to do some personal work in addition to working on the business.
Yeah, well, and I hear that. I mean, I hear that every time I interview a founder, when we talk about that. So you have about 26 employees. Tell me about the journey from you and your partner 4 years ago to where you are now and your personal talent strategy and where you've had challenges and made mistakes.
We had this conversation yesterday. And by the way, it never stops, nor should it.
Right.
It is. We are living in a very volatile.
Like a marriage.
It is.
You got to keep working on it.
Got to put in that effort.
Doesn't mean you have to put in time, all day long every day, but you do need to put work into it.
But with professional services, we're always caught in the same loop of when do we make investments in bringing in fixed cost, knowing that our contracts are rarely fixed cost contracts. And yet the expectations for most of our clients is for a start that is, I'll just say, ambitious. So we can't afford to keep 40 employees on staff, but we might have to spike up to 45 employees for an engagement that might last 3 months. So how do we accordion our talent and move it back and forward?
Yeah.
And that likely means we're working with a patchwork of people, a core staff, which has been in the organization 5 days a week, that works remotely, but still is dedicating their work hours to us. And a combination of that plus freelancers, gig-based workers, contractors, consultants, that we don't have guarantees on their time and their availability. So we have to look at this in a three-dimension where we say, okay, we may have the demand for the service, but we don't have the supply to be able to staff and support it. We can't actually make this work right now.
To deliver what we've promised. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's always that tension point that we're playing with. And that's been essentially the story since the beginning. It's always like, do we make the decision to make the investment here? Do we push the button on this? And we've had some missteps along the way. We've brought some people on board and it hasn't worked out. And in those cases, it's always a shared responsibility. Like we take just as much culpability for a relationship that didn't work because we ultimately set the conditions or the lack of conditions for success. And when something doesn't work out, that's partly on us. So it's been a really interesting transition. I mentioned earlier that some of those skills don't translate well from corporate to this. I think people management actually does translate quite well. At the end of the day, a business is a collection of people, and we just try to make sure that we're honest with people, transparent with them, give them opportunities, explain the limitations. And we find that goodwill more often than not lends it to our success. And we rarely find situations where it doesn't.
Carol Schultz here. Thanks for watching this excerpt from Authentically Successful. The conversation doesn't end there. So if you want to hear this episode in full and all my conversations with many other successful founders and CEOs, please visit verticalelevation.com/podcast.